Hi folks, welcome again to another episode of Pro Football in the 1970s. I'm your host Joe Zagorski. Now, thanks to the Sports History Network, a signed copy of my new book, The 2003 Yard Odyssey, The Juice, The Electric Company, and an Epic Run for a Record will be given away to one lucky fan. It's all about the 1973 Buffalo Bills. Please check out the Sports History Network online for details on how you can win a free copy of my new book on the 1973 Buffalo Bills. Thanks a lot for listening in to today's episode, folks. Look forward to chatting with you again soon in the future. Take care.
Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 5 months since my last confession and my last podcast.
You may begin, my son, and you can start by briefly describing your podcast. Briefly, please. There are other penitents waiting.
My best friend Sal told me he thinks this podcast is basically the Wonder Years meets Dark Side of the Ring. I was flattered by his summation. Those are both great television shows, and if this podcast sounds or feels anything like a mixture of the two, it is purely accidental. My original intention was just to recount my memories of past wrestling events and their impact on me. I think the first episode, which was a lot more off the cuff than the ones that followed, was the only episode that stuck to the original premise. A longtime fan of radio performer Joe Frank, I wanted my podcast format to be as varied as his was. Joe Frank's radio shows were a weekly potluck offering of absurd monologues and unique radio skits. Fans like me never knew what they were going to wind up hearing. That was the listening experience I sought to emulate. So while the podcast tends to be more about the telling of nostalgic stories from my boyhood with wrestling fandom, it is also somewhat confessional in nature. Quite a few episodes contain revelations about my personal life I've only disclosed to the closest of friends. There were also 2 guest interview episodes I had a lot of fun with. I had a lot of fun doing them, but contained sound glitches, my errors, that almost made the whole thing unlistenable. I published them anyway because the segments that weren't affected by the glitches were worth hearing as a whole. I was also lucky to have understanding guests who were kind enough to overlook the patchy sound quality. That helped a lot. I expect to add more guest interviews to the podcast in the future, as guest interviews are fun and help keep the podcast more centered on sports. Since there is such a thing as too much freedom, my tendency to veer off into experimentation demands restraint. A big idea for an episode parodying a popular television or radio show can stifle me from actually writing it. 2 weeks later, there's no episode to publish, and that's the reason I now sign off with, see you in 2 weeks. Maybe. It lessens expectations, assuming there are any, and makes me less of a liar. 2 weeks was always kind of an arbitrary, self-imposed deadline, but it's no reason not to deliver the show on time. Sometimes I can't find personal connections to any wrestlers or wrestling events or wrestling themes, and that keeps me from posting new shows, too. This is also not a good excuse, Father.
Get to the sin, my son.
Yes, of course. On July 3rd, 2024, my wife drove me to the hospital. We thought I was having a stroke because I couldn't move the right side of my face. It turned out I had Bell's palsy, not a stroke. Bell's palsy and stroke share the same lopsided face symptom that was my initial cause for alarm. Because the right side of my face was paralyzed, I had difficulty speaking, slurring my words and drooling. I couldn't blink my right eye, which led to dryness and excessive tearing, or lift my eyebrow or smile. There was also this unbearable pain radiating up and down my jaw and at the back of my right ear. The attending hospital doctor told me it could take up to 6 months for my facial paralysis to go away. There was a chance the paralysis could stay permanent. A small percentage of people never recover from the paralysis. The sour-faced expression caused by the palsy made me look bad-tempered and unfriendly, both of which I am generally not. It pained me to know that I might never have the somewhat sunny disposition I'd had before the onset of the bells. This dire possibility spurred me to think about pro wrestling commentator Jim Ross, a.k.a. Good Old JR, as he is known by WWE fans the world over. He is considered the greatest wrestling commentator of all time. Ross has had 3 bouts of Bell's palsy. The first attack happened on January 30th, 1994. Shockingly, because of his inability to perform his duties as a commentator, WWE fired Ross 2 weeks later. The second attack occurred in 1998, while in England, shortly after receiving news of his mother's passing. Soon after that second attack, a WCW wrestler named Ed Ferrara had the audacity to mimic Ross's impaired speech during rival WCW telecasts. It was received as being in poor taste by wrestling fans, wrestlers, and WWC owner Ted Turner alike, and was quickly dropped from Ferrara's act. On October 20, 2009, Jim Ross suffered his 3rd attack of Bell's palsy. According to Ross, it was his most debilitating attack yet. Having Bell's palsy in common with Jim Ross inspired me to write a podcast episode about my connection to Jim Ross, now that I had suffered Bell's palsy as well. This leads me to my sin, Father. The sin of exploitation. In other words, I believe exploitation is a sin. Certainly immoral. Wouldn't you agree?
The Bible tells us to love each other as we would love ourselves.
Right. I don't think I ever really cared much for Jim Ross or his medical condition, Bell's palsy, until I was afflicted with it myself. He didn't mean anything to me until now. And even now, I only think he means something to me because he's fodder for another podcast episode. One that's been a long time coming, overdue, if you will. So what I'm doing is using his medical condition to create a platform for a podcast. Isn't that self-serving, Father? Isn't that exploitative?
Do you think Jim Ross has ever used his medical condition to promote a wrestling storyline or gimmick?
That is a good question. Yes. Yes, there was a storyline that was used not long after Ross's second attack. I read it in Wikipedia. According to the Wikipedia entry on Ross,
on March 8th, 1999, Jim Ross returned to Raw as War as part of a storyline alleging that McMahon fired him because of his Bell's palsy, but that he would not go down quietly and enlisted the services of Dr. Death Steve Williams as his personal enforcer.
That's right. Now that we're talking about this, I remember what Jim Ross said about losing his smile. Brings a tear to my eye when I think about it. He said,
"The stress from my life at the time affected the Bell's palsy and created it. So, in a way, it did, and I've never smiled again. My 2 granddaughters are in the 10th grade and freshmen in college. They've never seen Granddad smile, so I lost my smile. It was a hand I was dealt."
I am so moved by that quote because I too have lost my smile. I too can no longer express facially what I used to do instinctively. It's the old adage, Father. I don't know who said it.
It was Joni Mitchell. Don't it always seem to go? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Big yellow taxi.
Yes, yes. I like the Counting Crows version, but I digress. The point is, smiling is important. Did you know children smile 400 times a day? Adults smile 20 times a day. Especially happy adults smile 40 to 50 times a day. Now I can't smile once a day. And to think my mother-in-law used to ask me to smile more often all the time. And I used to get annoyed at her doing so.
My second question to you, my son, is why do you want to tell anybody about your medical condition? Why is it important to you?
I don't know, Father. I want to say it's part of the confessional aspect of the podcast. As I told you earlier, there are things I've confessed to on the show that only my closest friends know about it. Some of them are only going to know about my bout with Bell's palsy when this episode is posted. But I think what I want to maybe just put it out there, it happened. It happens. It can happen to anyone. I'm honestly baffled as to why it happened to me. In medical parlance, Bell's palsy is known as an idiopathic disease because its onset is often sudden and unexplainable. According to information on the Mayo Clinic website, viral infections like herpes, rubella, mumps, and Epstein-Barr are often linked to Bell's palsy. People like me, obese, diabetic, and with high blood pressure, are more prone than others to the condition. Stress, cold air, and even lack of sleep have also been found with varying results to cause Bell's palsy symptoms. Check marks next to each box for me, as a few days before the onset of my condition, I had been particularly stressed about an upcoming family vacation, B, sleeping too close to the whirring cold air of a brand new fan, and C, sleeping 3 to 4 hours a day after my overnight shifts. A surefire way to suppress my immune system. On the bright side, there are just as many ways to treat Bell's palsy as there are causes. Taking oral steroids and antiviral medicines in the first few days of the onset is the first course of action. Prednisone and Valtrex were prescribed to me in the hospital right away. Physical therapy and acupuncture help restore facial muscle strength through exercise and pressure points. I've yet to make an appointment to see a therapist or an acupuncturist, but I plan on it. Continual use of artificial tears to wet and re-wet the eye that doesn't close prevents corneal abrasion. The dryness in my right eye is especially excruciating on very sunny days. On those sunny days, I wear an eye patch over my right eye to keep the glare out.
I can tell you right now, son, that I've learned more about Bell's palsy in the few minutes you've been in my confessional than in my whole lifetime.
Really, Father?
Yes, really. And that's because you've made a connection to Mr. Ross. And that connection is a conveyance of meaning. Hopefully, to anyone who doesn't know or wants to know more about your medical condition. You're framing it in the proper context to your show, and as far as I know, there is no sin in that.
My wife is Jewish. I guess she would call that a mitzvah.
It is indeed a good deed. My third question to you is, how are you feeling now?
Better, Father. The steroids have helped, and I'm getting more sleep, which is always a good thing. I still can't smile, but I'm speaking more clearly, and my face doesn't feel as lopsided as it was. Things are starting to even out. The worst part is my eye. It gets dry a lot, so I'm constantly re-wetting it with eye drops and gels at night. Overall, though, I consider myself a very lucky man that it wasn't a stroke.
The proper way to say it is, you are blessed. And what about Mr. Ross? How's he faring these days?
Well, Ross has battled other ailments as well as Bell's palsy.
about with colon cancer and skin cancer. And he emerged victorious with both, but he lives with Bell's palsy to this day, and it's a battle scar. I mean, he's been openly expressive about the fact that stress of all forms can contribute to the onset of Bell's palsy. It can happen again, and I guess that's something I have to be aware of as well. Bell's palsy can take on a mental aspect for the victim. One of the things I've noticed is an increased desire not to talk, which is hard for me, as I like to talk. I just don't like the way I sound. For Jim Ross, it had to be quadruple times mentally anguishing to get behind the mic after the first bout of Bell's palsy. It can certainly shake your confidence. But the man overcame whatever mental restraints might have held him back from public speaking, and today he is one of the living greats. Here's a quote from Ryan Dilbert from the Bleacher Report.
To hear a match with Ross on the call was to watch wrestling morph into poetry, for the scripted action to feel real, meaningful, and unforgettable. Debating the greatest pro wrestling commentator comes down to two men, Ross and Gordon Soley. As for the greatest in WWE history, there is no debate Ross stands alone.
Your penance is as follows. Say 1 hour Father and post your podcast ASAP. I will be listening, and so will he. Thank you, Father. You've been listening to Wrestling with Heels On. Join me in 2 weeks, maybe, for another stroll down Villainy Lane. Thank you, Jim Ross, for your talents and inspiration. Thank you, Wendy, my wife, for taking me to the hospital right away.
a mitzvah.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.